Greetings, comrades! Have you ever wondered how aliens live? What they breathe, where they go to work, what they do in the evenings, which products they buy in stores? Unfortunately, there's no way to know that yet. For all we know, the aliens closest to us may be some kind of silicon-based life form that look like huge cobblestones. But in the mid-20th century there were two worlds on Earth. Two camps that were almost like aliens to each other. Only instead of millions of light years, there was just the Iron Curtain, which was man-made. Nevertheless, it was quite effective in preventing people from finding out how their rivals on the other side live. You can probably vaguely imagine how life in the socialist countries was described by the capitalist camp. Today, however, we are going to talk about the opposite. About how the average Soviet person pictured the structure of the decadent West.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic.
The Iron Curtain finally fell for residents of the Soviet Union 32 years ago. May 20, 1991. The USSR passed a law on the order of entry and exit of Soviet citizens abroad and opened the borders. People trapped in their country for decades got a chance to see how the West really lives. For more than half a century up to that point, going abroad had been a dream, a symbol of chosenness and a measure of success. You've been to Bulgaria or GDR? You were the envy of all your neighbors. Somehow managed to get to the countries of the capitalist world. You were the most welcome guest at any feast, and your stories were listened to by absolutely everyone. And this despite the fact that the Western way of life in Soviet propaganda was considered an antagonistic way of life, alien to the Soviet person. Yet, people still were drawn to this foreign thing. Let us examine how this impenetrable curtain came into being. I think it's no secret that the expression Iron Curtain in reference to the conflict between two superpowers after World War II came into widespread use after Winston Churchill's speech in 1946. But the term itself was coined earlier. It was used, for example, by Joseph Goebbels and other German propaganda figures to describe Soviet actions during and after the war. In relation to the USSR, the term was first used as early as 1918 in the book The Apocalypse of Our Time by Vasily Rozanov. This expression was known inside the USSR even before the Cold War and was used to describe how the damned bourgeoisie of the West was trying to prevent the kindling of the fire of world revolution. It should be noted that from the very beginning the collective West had an ambivalent position in Soviet ideology and culture. On the one hand, it was a source of degradation and decay, a domain of the dying bourgeoisie and agonizing capitalism. By contrast, the Soviet Union was a source of rebirth and prosperity. It embodied the future of humanity. The West was its past. On the other hand, the West remained a repository of civilizational achievements, a reference point and an authority in matters of science, culture and technology, and the Soviet leadership welcomed Western experience. The role of Western technology in industrialization was not concealed back then. Therefore, it may come as a surprise to some, but until about the end of the 1930s the USSR was quite open to the world. The new Bolshevik regime needed to get out of its political and economic isolation, to get material aid and recognition of the new state by the leading world powers. And we should not forget the main goal of the revolution in the USSR. It was not the victory of communism in a single country, oh no. It was the victory of world internationalism. And how do you build a world internationalism? By locking yourself within your own borders. In fact, in less than 2 decades, the Soviets have successfully managed to convince many people on the planet that they are building the most advanced, equitable society in history. Everyone who sympathized with the idea of building socialism and wished to participate personally in it aspired to the Soviet Union, and the authorities were not opposed to it. Also, there were jobs in the Soviet Union even during the Great Depression. It was said that every week about 1,000 Americans arrived in Moscow during the early 1930s. Emigrants who had left Tsarist Russia for America and welcomed the victory of communism were also returning. Sometimes it worked the other way as well. In 1930, 257 people, of whom 244 were udarnikis, went on a cruise around Europe on the ship Abkhazia. It was a one-time event, which was turned into a beautiful PR campaign. They tried to show people the horrors of capitalism. Western countries were just experiencing the aftermath of the Great Depression, and cheerful look of the happy tourists from the Soviet Union was in clear contrast to the gloomy mood of the unemployed shipbuilders on the shores of Europe. All in all, the 20s and 30s were certainly the most open years in the relationship between the USSR and the Western world from the point of view of the common man. The Soviet man kind of knew how people lived in the West, because the channels of information were not yet close to him. Well, with the caveat that the state did not forget to remind him of the oppression of the poor working class there. Average Westerner also knew about life in the Soviet Union, with the caveat that many of the writers and journalists who visited the USSR were sympathetic to the ideas of communism, so they simply turned a blind eye to many of the drawbacks, skirting them in their articles and writings. The countries began to close off from each other by the end of the 1930s. The grim pre-war atmosphere in Europe, mutual distrust, and increased repressions in the USSR. It became clear that ideological disagreements, differences of interests, and mutual grievances between the West and the USSR could not be resolved so easily. And even 4 years of forced alliance against Hitler's Germany did not change the obvious. The Cold War and the Iron Curtain were just a matter of time. In general, there are two perspectives on the nature of the Iron Curtain. No, the fact that officially both sides blamed each other at the beginning of the Cold War is crystal clear. The question is whether the Iron Curtain was two-sided, or rather unilateral. Was the West's desire to close itself off from the USSR as big as the Soviet leadership's desire to shut itself off from the West? Historians still argue about this, but I personally believe that it was not. The Soviet authorities did not want their inhabitants to see how people in the West lived much more than the other way around, because ordinary people began to have questions immediately after the end of World War II and the return of soldiers from Europe. And why is that the war-torn Europe lives so much better than our beautiful Soviet country? You said that you have provided all the amenities required for the common man, but then why do ordinary people live better under the oppression of the bourgeoisie? And since there was no easy answer to this question in the even more destroyed post-war Soviet Union, the authorities happily resolved the issue in an isolationist way. The USSR was quickly drifting away from its former allies, and they were not lagging behind. They publicly compared it to Hitler's Germany and viewed it as a threat to the entire world. Gradually, the thought was firmly planted in the minds of the Soviet leaders that the Soviet Union did not really need the West. We have won, which means we have finally caught up with the West, and now we can show people that we have surpassed it. We just have to convince them of that. In May 1947, Nikolai Tikhonov's article In Defense of Pushkin began a campaign against worshipping the Western Soviet culture. The Soviet Union stopped sending delegations to Western film festivals, literary and scientific conferences. Russian literature was declared the greatest and therefore self-sufficient, never influenced by or attracted to the West. The same was happening in philosophy, arts and music studies, history and other sciences, including natural sciences. Yes, even in physics at one time they argued against quantum theory and the followers of Albert Einstein. It was declared that Western science was only appropriating great discoveries and achievements, and deliberately silencing the role of Russian scientists and inventors in human history. The population of the country was deprived both of the opportunity to travel abroad without the sanction of the authorities and to receive information not authorized by the government from the outside world. Any contact with foreigners had to be sanctioned by the authorities, even if a Soviet citizen simply wanted to practice his foreign language skills. Although, what skills? You are going to communicate with whom? However, this all worked in the first decade after the war. our scientists are the greatest, our writers are the most genius. Yeah, we just won the greatest war in history, we are a great country. Foreigners don't come to us, they're a loss. At that time, most Soviet citizens did not even think about traveling abroad, because they had enough to do at home. Gradually, Soviet residents' interest in foreign countries began to resume. Khrushchev came to power, and as a result, opportunities for Soviet citizens to travel abroad began to appear once again. Tourism began to develop, and the authorities welcomed this process, though they tried to strictly control it still. The authorities perceived outbound tourism as part of the system to popularize the Soviet Union in the international arena. Each tourist was supposed to be a kind of promoter of the homeland in the capitalist world and in the countries of the socialist camp. It turned out, however, as you know, a little differently. Although it probably wasn't tourism that was to blame. From the mid-1950s to the collapse of the USSR, more than 40 million people had traveled abroad. Roughly about 1/7 of the USSR's population at the time of its collapse. And that includes trips to friendly socialist countries, where in general everything was about the same as in the USSR, only slightly better. That is, somewhere between 85 and 90% of Soviet citizens have never been outside of the USSR. And of course, they rapturously listen to the stories of those who managed to do it. Almost everyone who has been abroad necessarily shared their impressions of the magical hours spent at the windows with fashionable clothes, of the horrific problems of choice in the store, when you do not know what yogurt you should buy because there are dozens of them, and those high-quality and exotic foreign items which people manage to bring with them. That is why, in the eyes of the average Soviet man, an image was formed that was exactly the opposite of what the Soviet government wanted to create. The West is not a decaying wasteland where capitalist predators oppress, rob and enslave poor peoples. The West is a paradise which has everything. As a result, we get a dissonance. What was an ordinary Soviet man supposed to think? Is the Soviet Union a socialist heaven on earth, where everything is built and done for the people, unlike the cursed West? Or is the capitalist West a place where you can get anything you want? In fact, these 2 points got along quite well in the minds of Soviet people. Soviet citizens in general believed the propaganda, pitied oppressed black Americans and feared CIA spies.
The people don't have power in your country. What you have is crime, sadism, unemployment, drug addiction. I don't think your young people do anything but harm to their country.
While at the same time wearing the best in the world American jeans, listening to Pink Floyd and dreaming of going abroad. On the one hand, people were aware that they were indeed severely restricted by the exit visa system, but on the other hand, the United States and the Soviet Union were adversaries, and this was not a fantasy of the Soviet authorities. Therefore, the existence of such a strict exit system in some ways could be considered justified. Again, this curtain was total only in the years of the late Stalin. The Khrushchev thaw was characterized by a significant intensification of the Soviet Union's international contacts and the weakening of many barriers. For example, the World Youth Festival in Moscow in 1957, when many people actually got to interact with their peers from different countries for the first time. It was during Khrushchev's rule that prominent exhibitions of Soviet scientific, technological and cultural achievements were held in America, and American ones in Moscow. Visits by representatives of Western countries to the USSR and by Soviet figures to the United States and Europe became more frequent. And it was probably during Khrushchev's reign that Soviet people finally became convinced that the capitalist way of life was probably not so bad. Beginning in the 1960s, Soviet people formed an idea of some abstract West, a dream country that might not even exist. Even the word «заграница», which was common at the time, was not an exact synonym for «за границей», abroad. It was not just a territory outside the Soviet state, but a certain space. real and abstract, familiar and inaccessible, ordinary and exotic at the same time. The dissonance also manifested itself in the official policy of the Soviet Union. The Soviet state has always made a distinction between acceptable and unacceptable forms of Western culture and constantly tried to draw a line between them. Ideological postulates were increasingly at odds with the reality in which Soviet people lived. In the 70s, it was not unusual for example, a secretary of the Komsomol committee to make ideologically correct speeches about the inevitable victory of communism and the withering West at party meetings, and at the same time listen to forbidden foreign radio, wear foreign jeans, keep records of Deep Purple, and have a nickname Paul among friends. Forbidden fruit is always sweet, thus the interest in Western culture and goods in the USSR was enormous. People tried to obtain Hollywood movies, read Western books, and you all saw these gigantic lines outside the first McDonald's. This reflected the duality of the Soviets' approach to the Iron Curtain. On the one hand, people in the USSR were well aware that the communist idea was essentially an internationalist idea, meaning belonging to all of humanity. On the other hand, Soviet people were also quite aware that there was little or no possibility of direct confrontation with people outside the Soviet state borders. People dreamed of Western things, but nevertheless, until the collapse of the USSR as a whole, they were still overall loyal to Soviet humanist ideas and values. Nevertheless, most of the things that contributed to the idealized image of the West appeared in Soviet life not in spite of the state, but largely due to its paradoxical ideology and inconsistent cultural policies. When perestroika began to open the sacred Soviet border in the late 1980s, it suddenly became apparent that the imaginary West was quite different from the real West. When some Soviet people first went abroad in the late 1980s, their most unexpected discovery was not the high standard of living, but the sudden realization that the real West was something ordinary, even prosaic. A Soviet man traveling to the United States for the first time thought that America is a cheerful, carefree and exciting world, filled with bizarre names, sounds and images. And at the same time, FBI agents, drug addicts, AIDS and other trappings of capitalism were waiting for him everywhere. And it turned out that America is the boring, deserted and dusty streets of some Phoenix, Arizona. And that the Iron Curtain did not protect him from capitalist hell, nor did it block the road to capitalist paradise. It simply separated him for half a century from, by and large, people just like him. Well, let's hope that 30 years after the first curtain fell, the new one will be at least a little more penetrable. Thanks for watching, and a huge shout out to Steak221, Steven, Yelizaveta Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Böse, Jordan LaMothe, Jimmy Albin, Eli and Petar Ilic. See you guys next time.